You're listening to The Dirt on the Past, a show on history and archaeology and why it matters today. You can find us on the Extreme History Project website and also on kgbm.org. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we're co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past. This week, we are speaking with Dr. Mary Murphy, who is here at Extreme History Headquarters with us today. And we're excited to talk with Mary. But before we do that, we're glad to be back after, several weeks off having our hiatus. So, Crystal, I want to catch up with you on what you've been doing. How have your past few weeks been?
They've been really good. We've been doing a lot of summertime things like walking tours. The walking tours have been great. We've had so many people.
Have they been filling up?
Come, yes,
Nice,
yes.
nice.
And, of course, Murders, Madams, and Mediums, our walking tour is the most popular. People love to hear about murder and mayhem. So,
Are you getting out-of-towners? Because there's a lot of out-of-town license plates out there right now.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of people from out of town coming to do tours, which is great. We love to talk about our history, our Bozeman history, but really Montana and national history as well. So walking tours have been great these last few weeks. And then also we did our grand opening for our used bookshop that we have, which
congratulations.
is so good. Yeah, it was
That's
wonderful.
awesome. What did you do? What was the plan for the grand opening?
It was open. We were open from about 1 to 5. We had balloons outside because, there's no grand opening is proper without balloons. So
absolutely.
So we had balloons, we had snacks, we had tons of people come, and it was so much fun to introduce everybody to our new used bookshop.
I hope you made some sales, too.
We did. We
Yeah.
definitely did, and got some of those Montana history books out there in people's hands. And Mary, you donated some books that we sold, and they were a hit. They were a hit.
Happy to clean my bookshelves. You'll get more.
Good. That's how it works. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to put a Mary Murphy section saying these are from the Mary Murphy collection, but I didn't do that. That would have been fun to do. So Nancy, what about you? Because you have had some amazing adventures.
Part of the reason for our hiatus was I actually took a trip with my husband to Europe, and we went to Italy. We got in after wondering if our COVID tests and our vaccine cards and everything would allow us in, and that was great. And we were in northern Italy, kind of centered around Bologna. Have you ever been, Mary?
No.
I had never been to Italy, and luckily my nephew had spent a semester there studying physics, surprisingly. But Bologna has an amazing history in the north, and they actually are known, I should say this, for their cuisine. Everyone goes to Bologna for their cuisine. So they have one of the, all parts of Italy have, different wines and different cuisines, but Bologna is known for being, I think they call it something that has to do with like fat and flavor. And I was like, I'm in. So they had amazing food there, and amazing thing about Bologna is the whole city has these arcades, these like sheltered arcades. Everywhere you walk, you can be under one, so you're sheltered from the sun, from the rain. Beautiful. It's a lovely city to walk around in and everything. So we did a lot of stuff there, great museums, basilicas, all of that. Then we were in the Dolomites for a while, and then I went to Greece to meet my daughter after she did a 2-week program, and we went to the island of Santorini, or Thera, which this is a place I hadn't been in 30 years. I was 20 when I was last there, and it is one of my favorite spots in all of Greece, and probably of all the Cycladic islands, because it's one that's often most associated with Atlantis and the whole myth. And I don't know if you know about this, Mary, or you know about this, Crystal, but it was originally more of a circular-shaped island, but it's a very volcanic island, and it had this amazing eruption in somewhere between 15 and 1600 BC, and a whole bunch of it sunk. And on one part of the island, it created a Pompeii of a Bronze Age site called Akrotiri. So the archaeology there is amazing. And the thing is, not that long afterwards, people kept inhabiting it. So they were a great seafaring culture before and after that eruption. And the Venetians actually took it over for a while too. I had 4 hours in Venice, and that was cool. Wow. But so more overwhelming history and archaeology than I could cram into our banter section here. But it was a really wonderful trip, and it just made me want to go back and bring all my friends. So Crystal, you have to come next.
I know. I want to.
I know. And Mary, if you have any desire at all, this is the Greek island I would recommend. It's so good. It's so good.
Oh, that sounds so fun.
It was really fun.
It was fun to follow you along on Facebook and see where you were and what you were experiencing, and it looked beautiful. So
we had a lot of fun. So thanks for asking about that. But there's no place like home. It's always good to come home after all that traveling and everything. So happy to be back. We are so happy to have you here with us today, Mary.
Oh, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be here in this wonderful history place that you've created and talk to you today.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you with us.
Yeah, so now we want to start off by telling our listeners a little bit about you, which is how we start most of our shows with our guests. So Dr. Mary Murphy is a distinguished professor of history at Montana State University in Bozeman, and she's the director of the Ivan Doig Center for the Study of Lands and Peoples in the North American West. She teaches courses in American history with a special focus on gender in the North American West. Among her books are Hope in Hard Times, New Deal Photographs of Montana, 1936 to 1942, and Mining Cultures, Men, Women, and Leisure in Butte, 1914 through 1941.
Welcome, Mary. We're going to also start by asking you how you got interested in history, how you came to history. And I don't think I've ever asked you this question, so I'm so excited to hear the answer.
When did you know it was going to be your profession?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I didn't know it was going to be my profession until quite late, but I would say that I came to history as a little kid. Because
really?
I grew up in Massachusetts. And my sisters and I used the old colonial cemeteries as our playgrounds. So we were surrounded by all of those great gravestones.
And those are the really good gravestones, right? They have a
the
lot of symbolism.
The death's head with the angel
it's kind of creepy, but really cool
exactly.
too. Yeah.
So very appealing to children. Yeah. And my dad liked history, and on weekends he would take us to, Bunker Hill Monument and the Constitution and Walden Pond. So we were just kind of steeped in it. And when I was thinking about this, when I was in the 4th grade, I won the prize for reading the most books in the children's room at the public library. And I picked as my prize an American history textbook.
Whoa.
Is that like nerdy or what?
That's very cool. Why do you think you picked it?
I just loved those stories. And I loved, I think on some level I realized here I was in this landscape where, the American Revolution was born and all of this history took place. And I really liked those stories. And then when I eventually was in college, I ended up taking a course in the history of working people in America.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
It was really interesting. It's what we would now call labor history. And the teacher turned out to have his father worked in the same factory in Worcester, Massachusetts that my grandfather had worked in.
Oh, my gosh.
And no one in my family had gone to college at all. And I remember going to his office one day and saying, how do I get to do this?
Right.
Yeah. And so he put me in touch with some labor historians at different universities. And this was pre-email, and I typed little letters and said, what is your program like? And et cetera, et cetera. And they all wrote back these incredibly gracious letters.
Wow.
So it kind of sealed my fate.
Wow.
Right.
So then
the door was open.
Yeah.
So then you went on to get a master's degree and a PhD?
Yes. So I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Okay.
And I happened to be there shortly after the Southern Oral History program got started.
Oh, my goodness.
So I took a seminar in oral history and then worked for that project interviewing textile workers because the program had gotten a large NEH grant to study the transition from a agricultural to an industrial society.
Okay.
So, it got me out in North Carolina, away from the university. I was the only Yankee on the project.
Wow.
And it was just so much fun and so interesting.
And what a great way to do history. You're talking to people, you're not only in the archives.
Right.
You know? Wow.
Right.
And what, a basis for interview skills you have the rest of your career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What a great way to learn how to do oral history right off the bat.
Exactly.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was that experience that led me to Butte.
Okay.
Oh.
Yes, because in that oral history class was a woman who had worked in Montana, and she was studying folklore. The University of North Carolina had a great folklore program, and so one of the faculty told us about this grant that the NEH had at the time. It was called the Youth Grant Program. It no longer exists, and we wrote this proposal to go to Butte. Which was it's where the Western Federation of Miners was founded, where the Western labor movement was born, and a site of a lot of rich folklore associated with mining, to do an oral history project. And lo and behold, we got it.
Wow.
So we came to Butte, Montana in January.
Oh my.
So when you say we, how many?
Just this one other woman.
Okay.
And we rented a little apartment in Uptown.
Oh my gosh.
And the folks at the Butte Historical Society were really welcoming. And one of them knocked on the door and bounded up the stairs one day with a little file box full of index cards with the names of people he thought we should interview.
Wow.
So
That's amazing.
Can I ask what year this was?
This was 1980.
So I'm trying to think of what Butte would have been like then compared to recently.
I didn't really realize at the time because I was trying to study the history, but that was the real tumult of the Anaconda Company pulling out, what was going to happen with the pit.
Wow.
So there was a lot
No
of...
Superfund site yet.
No
none of that.
Superfund site yet. And there were a lot of, some newcomers who were working for the National Center for Appropriate Technology, which was this very innovative program. And so there were young people who were preservationists and writers and graphic designers and scientists, and they all were taken, as was I, with this amazing place. Just this incredible landscape, and then this rich history.
Right.
So several of them joined the Historical Society. So it was a very unique, to me, and as I look back now after all this time, confluence of young people really interested in the older residents who were desperately trying to preserve these stories and these buildings, and they really worked together. It was a very welcoming place.
Wow.
And you had the vision to somehow divine that from what you learned about it, and you went ahead and went. So did that then mean that Butte became a focus of work after that, or did you go back and do something else?
Well, I kind of joke, but this is true. When I got off the bus, because I flew into Missoula to meet this friend, and then we took the bus.
Wow.
And it was a beautiful winter day. We were driving through the Deer Lodge Valley, and all of the willows were coated with ice, and the sky was blue, and I was like, oh my, I've never seen anything like this.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we arrive in Butte, and there's the Continental Divide, and this city that looked like the East Coast.
It does.
Right?
The same architecture. Yep.
But in this amazing mountain setting. And it was full of the kind of people I grew up with, all these different ethnic,
There's a lot of Irish people in Massachusetts and in Butte. Yep.
In fact, I say, my name is Mary Murphy, and I know how to speak Irish Catholic.
Yeah, there, me too.
So I had, by the time people when I would introduce myself, when I was trying to set up an interview, as Mary Murphy, blah, blah, blah. By the time they realized I wasn't from Butte, it was all okay.
Yeah, because you had the name.
Right.
You had the name that brought you in.
And so many of the miners were Irish.
Right.
I had no idea until I moved to Montana.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And so was the focus for this grant proposal and for this Project Butte, just because of all that labor history there.
Yes.
And so that, I mean, I was just surprised that was on anyone's radar at that time, but it was, huh?
I think the 1980s were a real, the 70s and 80s were a real flourishing of labor history, of the social history movement, looking at ordinary working people, starting to look at racial minorities, looking at women, to revise the standard narrative of American history. So I think there was a lot of interest at that time. And when I was there, we were young. I mean, it was only my second year in graduate school. What did I know? And I, took their recommendations. Oh, you should talk to so-and-so and so-and-so. There wasn't a lot of coherence to this project, I have to say. But I got really interested in women's stories because as I did a lot of reading, and I have to say, the training that I got in North Carolina was you would never go out on an interview unless you had done a lot of research. And I came to realize, how skewed the gender ratio had been in Butte, really until the 40s.
Wow.
And it was so interesting because unlike the South, where I had been interviewing textile workers, or the Northeast, where I grew up, there were no industrial jobs for women. Women's jobs were in the service sector. In fact, in Montana, the greatest number of women who worked for wages worked in domestic service into the 1940s. So I thought, how do women negotiate this very male-dominated world? Where were their spaces? And I didn't have the academic language at the time to really conceptualize that, but I knew these stories. That I talked to people who, were waitresses or boarding housekeepers, and I just became really fascinated with women's history.
So these are the things that were sort of missing from the labor histories that maybe you were studying in school. So that kind of gets us to our next question was, knowing that a lot of your early research was about Butte, because you studied not only labor, and I don't know if this grew out of, as you're saying, your oral histories, but prostitution, women's history, what women did, as you said, in their spaces, but also in their leisure time. How did all of this work in a really industrial city, pretty much the only one in this part of the West? That sounds amazing to me. So tell us a little bit about, how those interviews maybe led to your delving into women's history and understanding their leisure time and work time.
Well, I went, I worked for 6 months or something in Butte, and then I went back to Chapel Hill to continue my classes. And I wanted to write about Butte for my master's thesis, and I wanted to write about women. And interestingly enough, and both of you know this from your own research, the women who appeared most in public records were prostitutes, right? They were arrested. There were stories in the paper about violence or suicide. There were the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps that clearly labeled the shift of where the red light district moved. And so that had not been my original interest, but from afar, those were the records that I could access. So I ended up writing my master's thesis on prostitution in Butte. But also in the same time, when I had left Butte after that first project, I had said to the people at the Historical Society, well, if any work comes up, let me know. And so I get this call one day, and they had gotten a grant to do a building inventory for the National Historic Landmark of the National Historic Landmark District. And I said, well, I don't know anything about architecture. And they said, we can teach you. So I went back for several summers and worked on that, and wonderful. Became really interested. And as I learned more about Butte and thinking about it in comparison to the places I had learned about in the South, what became really clear was, as dominant as the Anaconda Copper Mining Company was, Butte was not a company town like southern mill towns were. In southern mill towns, the mill often owned all the housing. They decided which churches could be built there. They had company stores where you had to buy your groceries and supplies and everything. And Butte didn't have that. I mean, Montana was dominated by the political and economic power of the Anaconda Company, but they didn't seem interested in controlling that daily life, right? So the schools were public schools and Catholic schools. They weren't supported by the company. There seemed to me at the time, a zillion different churches of all denominations.
Right.
Seems like, there was a church everywhere.
Right. It was Hennessy's department store was not a company store. There were all kinds of groceries and merchants.
All independent.
All independent. And then there was this, kind of rich social life. I mean, I knew about prostitution in the red light district, but also the saloon culture, movie theaters, drama,
theater, all kinds of
things, cafes, restaurants.
Right.
And so I started thinking, well, how do people exhibit autonomy in places of leisure, right? They don't have much autonomy at work, right? They're in the mines. Right. Even though there's a union, there's not a lot of leeway in terms of how you can do your work, et cetera, et cetera. And so I started thinking about that contrast between Southern company towns where people were often quite monitored and moral judgments made upon their character. And, if a foreman or a superintendent didn't like how you behaved, you could be fired and lose your house. So it's not like you could stay in your house and then find a job in another place. The mill was the only place to work. So I just, and I also have to say that knowing, I was interested in labor history and I was interested in the history of labor organizations, but also knowing that the Anaconda Company controlled the newspapers, I thought it was very difficult to get the labor perspective at that time. Sure. And we didn't have the kind of digital sources that we now have to get multiple perspectives. So I decided to focus on leisure.
So before we go any further, because I want to dive into that, can you just give for our listeners who may not be familiar with the history of Butte, just kind of a little bit of a sense of that history and its importance and significance, so how it got going and up to the time period that you were focusing on?
Sure, because as everybody who knows me knows, Butte is the most interesting city in the West.
Of course it is.
Apologies to people who don't live there.
It is called Butte, America.
It is called Butte, America, right. But it started as a, Western mining camp. There was a discovery of gold and then of silver. And it looked like it was going to die out because they weren't very rich deposits. And then in the early 1880s, these very rich veins of copper were discovered. And, that happened to coincide with the electrical revolution in America. So you needed copper for electricity. You needed copper to electrify railroads and to electrify city streets and homes and everything.
And around the world, not just in the U.S. You needed it everywhere.
And if you wanted indoor plumbing. I mean, there are thousands of houses still in Montana that have pipes made by the Anaconda Company.
Wow.
We have a copper pipe right over
there.
here.
Yeah. It's beautiful,
I don't know if it's original or not.
Exactly. Yeah. So it had tremendous economic significance. And for historians of technology and science, all kinds of innovations in mining, because it had, one of the nicknames for Butte was Mile High and Mile Deep, right? The altitude is, you're at about 5,000 feet, and some of those mine shafts went a mile down and just riddled the whole hill. So from the mining history point of view, it's very fascinating. But then it also brought this amazing diversity of people, right? So Nancy, you mentioned the Irish miners and the Cornish miners who were already very skilled from working in tin and copper mines in Cornwall.
Right.
But then there were just waves of immigration. So people from, Eastern Europe, a lot of people from Canada, and some of them tended to congregate in different areas. So the Irish lived in Dublin Gulch, and the Cornish lived in Centerville, and the Finns lived in Finntown, and they didn't always get along, right? But there was, just to me, this really fascinating culture of all these different people there. And then the whole labor organizing perspective. You
Right.
know, how did the people come together to form unions, and how successful was that? And of course it was driven by the miners, but then all these other trades and groups unionized as well. So, you know, skilled workers like plumbers and electricians had their own union, carpenters had their own unions. The first telephone operators union in the United States was formed in Butte.
Really?
That's
Wow.
fascinating.
So there was this real kind of, even though it was so diverse, democratic kind of spirit to sort of maybe not just accept this top-down approach to how their lives were organized and managed. And,
Right,
okay.
right. And that was part of a larger national labor movement as well. You know, we're talking the late 19th century, the Gilded Age, robber barons,
Right.
questions about can a democracy live with these powerful monopolies?
Kind of feel like that sounds very
I know,
familiar
I
for
know.
the present day, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
right? Who should be, and I have to say, you know, these unions, it's not like they were these ideal, welcoming organizations. They kept out Chinese.
Right.
You know,
Right. So you couldn't join it.
They felt
Ugh.
they were threatened, that, you know, Chinese workers threatened their position. Samuel Gompers, who was the head of the American Federation of Labor in the early 20th century, he wrote this pamphlet that said something like meat versus rice, American citizens versus Chinese coolieism, which will survive.
Wow.
And of course, the pamphlet had nothing to do with food, but it was just identifying,
Right.
you know,
The
people.
basic staple as perceived.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, because African Americans wouldn't have been included in those at all.
No.
Right.
Right.
And of course, Native people were just, you know, on the reservations by this point.
Yeah,
And,
there were small populations of landless
Yeah.
Indians at times, and there was a small African American community, many of whom had worked on the railroad, and a few professionals, but they were not welcome in the mines.
Right.
And were the Chinese welcome in the mines or not?
No, not in the underground mines. You know, the Chinese, of course, had worked in the placer mining, the surface mining.
Sure.
But by the time Butte was founded, placer mining was sort of in the past in Butte. I mean, people still went out hoping to gold
Strike
pan,
it rich.
But it wasn't
find
a big rush
nugget.
to
It wasn't
find,
a big rush.
Yeah.
And so when the Chinese came to Butte, they really are in service occupations.
Okay. Laundry and all sorts
cooking.
of things involved in prostitution, as well as lots of other people as well. Okay.
And there was some, and the copper was the copper Anaconda Copper Company was really in charge of all of this copper extraction, or was there other companies that were?
There were other companies. I mean, it didn't start out as a monopoly. There were several other companies, and but by around, I believe it would be 1906, though I have to confess, as a historian, I'm terrible at dates. So you should double check. But the Anaconda Copper Company does consolidate a lot of these. And there were, there's a famous book for those of us who love Butte called The War of the Copper Kings. So there are these battles between, the different owners of companies. And so it was a very tumultuous time. And the workers were not unified. There were factions who supported different groups. But the other really fascinating part about workers' political and cultural life is Butte was also the scene of a lot of different radical movements. So the socialists were there. It had a socialist mayor in the teens. The industrial workers of the world were active. There was the infamous lynching of Frank Little. And so people, people might all agree that the power of a corporation needed to be checked in some way, but they didn't all agree on how or what the political philosophy
and how that would get
be.
Divided up then too, if power was being, divvied out in different places. Okay, so you say that Butte was never and then didn't even become one of these community towns. It was probably too big, and there was all these other things going on for whatever reason. It had a university, still has one. So there's other probably power centers to some degree, but all these other things going on. So back to your research about your master's research about prostitution, and then just you're interested in women and leisure time. Tell us what you found about both those things. Was there anything that surprised you about prostitution in Butte or women's leisure time? Give us a little summary of that work.
So I think that, like many people who read about the American West, I had this naive and somewhat romanticized view of prostitution. I mean, when you just think of the titles of the books, Red Lights on the Prairie, Soiled Doves, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it was a horrible, sordid, hard, vicious, violent life. And, women turned to alcohol and drugs to ameliorate their conditions. There were many fake memoirs of prostitutes.
Interesting.
They were actually written by reformers to try and, publicize the horrors of prostitution and try to, this is again the progressive era trying to clean up society, and there were big government and federal investigations into prostitution in the United States. But one memoir that has been documented called Madeline, she works in Chicago and she ends up getting on a train, and I still remember I was sitting in the library at the University of North Carolina. I turned the page, and she says, and I got off the train in Butte, Montana. I was like, oh my gosh.
Right. And then what happened?
Then what happened? And
why did she go to Butte? Do you know?
Well, I think that she, like many workers, including prostitutes, they were very mobile. They would go where they heard there was money. And this is a big booming mining town.
Right.
And she had a gambling addiction. There was a lot of wide open gambling in Butte. But when she later writes her memoir, she commented that she had never seen such sordid conditions for prostitutes as those who worked in Butte.
Oh gosh. Wow.
Wasn't she the one that talked about how prostitutes would work in these dingy basements on dirt floors? Was that hers?
I can't remember if that's the description, but she does. I did that in looking at at prostitution in Butte. Did see this kind of hierarchy of women who worked in parlor houses for madams who paid off the police and they had protection, and then poorer women who might have been drug addicts or alcoholics or couldn't afford the clothing that would be required to work in a parlor house or a brothel, ended up in these what were called cribs, these little rooms that they would rent by the day or the night.
Yeah.
So the story of a madam with a house, like a brothel that we're in, that's really not the majority of women who had to work that way.
And she would even comment that the madams were, they controlled what clothing they would say, okay, you have to buy your clothing from this and such a person.
Okay.
Right, and they would take a cut. And so it was very, you traded any kind of autonomy for some protection.
Yeah. Wow.
And the food even the food they ate, they had to pay for in those houses, and the clothing that they had, and then if they left, they couldn't take any of the clothing with them.
Right.
And so it was just this cycle. It was just,
You're stuck.
You're stuck.
Like indentured servitude.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I remember her talking about that in that book. And so, just awful.
So for the other women who maybe had leisure time, or even these women, aside from gambling, what kind of things did you find?
Well, I'm not sure, but I mean, I imagine the prostitutes rested when they could.
Sure. They were probably sleeping.
But I mean, I also looked at the interwar period from 1914 to 41, because that was when Butte was starting to go into decline in terms of population. And, a lot of Western history was written about the boom times, and the sort of triumphant story of settling the West, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wanted to know, what was it like when World War I started, when these labor troubles hit, et cetera. And that, of course, coincided with Prohibition in the 1920s and women getting the right to vote. And so it was an interesting story of women coming into the 20th century in in an industrial city where there were a lot of commercial amusements, and so a lot of struggles with their families. What, you're going to the dance hall?
Right.
With who?
Yeah. All new.
All new stuff, and you're getting your hair cut in a bob, and you're wearing that short dress.
You're showing your ankles.
Right, and aren't you going to Mass on Sunday? So, it was interesting to see those family tensions, and just through memoirs and oral histories and people, and little stories in the paper. So, like a federal, again, part of this progressive era worry about people's morality, the U.S. Children's Bureau set up an investigation of dance halls.
Really?
So so they send a woman she travels throughout the country, but she comes to Butte to visit dance halls and to see, what's going on.
They were like, who is that lady in the corner who's taking notes and staring at everyone? Oh my gosh. Or was she out there like boogieing? I'm trying to imagine.
That might be the best job in the world. I don't know.
But there was so much. I mean, and if you think about, here's a town with a wide open red light district as well.
Right.
And then these young women who are starting to work in the new department stores or as waitresses, they have some money, even though most of them give most of their money to their mother. But, they go to movies, they might be there sitting in the dark with a young man. And so it's just part of that whole national trend toward commercialized leisure and dating versus just going to chaperone parties at people's houses and things like that, and so there would be stories, and it would tie interestingly into the labor situation, because there would be stories in the newspaper that the department stores paid young women so little that they had to work as freelance prostitutes.
Yeah. Oh my word.
That's right.
Okay, that couldn't be good though for the department store.
Well,
upside downside. There's like a little bit of, I don't know.
And you said in your master's thesis that they paid the men more. They paid the women significantly less. And that's how a lot of these women got into prostitution, because men would come into the department store and they'd see these women and they'd say, would you like to go out for dinner?
Right.
And the woman would go to dinner and have a free dinner and be like, wow, this is the best I've eaten in a week, because they made so little they could barely survive. And then maybe the next date he'd give her a trinket, and she's like, oh, and these women were probably poor from poor families.
And innocent. Yeah. This was all new territory.
Slippery slope to prostitution.
Yeah, and then you add in automobiles and roadhouses. Yes. And so you can see why the clergy and parents and reformers
they were onto it.
They knew. They were nervous. They were nervous. And we'll never know how many, the stories are very sensational and, but if you're thinking about what concerns, and then you could try to read behind the text and I talked to several women who worked, who had been workers, and then the women, one of the most interesting unions in Butte was called the Women's Protective Union. Oh. And it was a union for unskilled women who were cooks and chambermaids. I mean, I now think cooking is a skill, but at the time it was not defined as a skilled labor. Theater ushers, all kinds of that sort of early service, and they were labor, and they were all in this one union. And they talked about how great the union was for them as a social network. So they'd work, they'd go to a union meeting, and then they'd go to the movies or to an ice cream parlor.
So a much safer way to socialize and spend your time. Okay.
Right, yeah.
Wow.
Did those unions really help women make better pay or have better social or working situations?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Really?
The women who were the business managers, who were the enforcers for the labor rules, they would walk into a cafe, and if a woman was sweeping the floor and her job was dishwasher, they'd take the broom out of her hand and they'd say, "You are not doing that job." Oh my gosh!
Really? That is amazing. Oh my gosh!
They were fearless.
Wow. Okay. All right. We're going to get to some more interesting questions, but we're going to take a quick station break. You are listening to The Dirt on the Past with co-hosts Crystal Alegria and Nancy Mahoney on KGVM Bozeman or wherever you find your podcasts. We're speaking today with Mary Murphy about her work on gender and food history and Butte, Montana.
So, Mary, I want to come back and talk a little bit about women in Butte, kind of stay on this idea of women in Butte, and talk about a woman who you've written on, whose name is Mary Mclean. And she lived in Butte, not for a long time, but she lived there for a few years. And she was a person we really see all these changes that you were just talking about happening within her life. And then she luckily wrote about them in a book. And that was in about 1902. So just right at at this time that you're talking about, a little bit before the focus of 1914 to 1941. But she really lived into that era. So she wrote a book kind of about her leisure time, kind of about her life, and kind of about her frustrations with her life as a young woman growing up in Butte in 1902. And she really challenged the notions of what young middle-class women were supposed to think and feel. So they, there was a lot of restrictions on these women. Like you were saying, their parents were like, what? You're going to the dance hall? What? You're not going to go to mass? And so I think a lot of women were pushing against some of these. And Mary Mclean was definitely one of them who did this. So she outraged readers when she claimed that she wanted not merely romance, but seduction. So I think that's and you wrote that in this article that you wrote about her, and I love that. And so she really craved different and expanded experiences than she had had in her young life. But I think as she was seeing other women around her not having experience, and she wanted other women to have experience too, as well as herself. And of course, this book she wrote was a hit. So can you talk a little bit about her and her life and why you think her book hit such a chord with women at this time?
Well, I think she was exactly what she wanted to be, and that was outrageous. Wow. I was thinking about her and thinking she didn't really care what people thought about her as long as they were thinking about her. Today we might say she wanted to be a celebrity.
Exactly. Yes.
But she also, I think, broke a mold of, there were some other writers at the time, this Diary of Opal Whitley, who also talked about their sort of inner life, right? And so she talks about, walking the sand pits, which of course there really weren't sand pits in Butte, but she took poetic license and thinking about what a dark, barren landscape, and how was she ever going to have experience and have life and meet the devil. And she talks about sensuality. And so she sends this, and she was frustrated because her stepfather, according to the story, had lost the money that he supposedly put aside to send her and her sister to college. So she wasn't going to be able to go to college. Okay. And she sort of sees herself stuck in Butte. And so she's writing this diary. There's a lot more scholarship on her now than when I wrote, and I'll tell you a little bit about how to find that. But she sends off to this publisher a beautifully handwritten, so it's not like the scratched daily diary. So there's a construction there to her narrative. But for some reason, she sends her book to this religious press. Oh dear. In Chicago, who fortunately said, "This is not for us, but let me send it across the street to this other publisher."
That was very kind. They didn't burn it. They didn't send it.
Absolutely. And so Herbert Stone Publisher publishes the book, and as you said, Crystal, it becomes a hit. And I think it was just, where in 1902 would you read the memoir of a young woman who talks about wanting to dance with the devil and, fall in love with people of different genders and,
wow.
you know, all of this kind of stuff. And so she takes her, what at the time were considerable royalties, and leaves Butte as fast as she can.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and she's kind of like a, you know, this hot flame for a while.
Mm-hmm.
She got lots of acclaim, and she loved that. And then her life gets rockier and also more harder to track. But she goes to New York City. There's quite a bohemian culture there in Greenwich Village.
Right.
She associates with other women who were in a club called I can't remember the name of it now, but other women of kind of like minds.
Okay.
Yeah.
And she has a series of lovers, male and female. At one point, she stars in a film. I don't think anybody's been able to find an extant copy of it.
No,
my goodness.
I have.
No.
Read
So
it.
Where's the information come from that she was in a film?
Oh, that was pretty well documented in newspapers.
Interesting.
And stuff. So there's actually quite a bit of information
There's
about
got to
that.
be some copy of it
I
somewhere.
know.
Someday maybe they'll find one.
Right, right. And then she writes 2 more books. She writes another book called Annabelle Lee, a kind of conversation with a young woman, and then she writes another memoir.
Oh.
But neither of those were as well received or as sensationally received because it wasn't as sensational.
Right.
Where are you going to go
It was
from
kind of
there?
there.
Yeah. And so she kind of lives off the kindness of some friends and strangers, and she dies, we think, of tuberculosis in a boarding house in Chicago.
In Chicago.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's this fantastic website called the Mary Mclean Project. And some people have just became entranced with her, and they have published a Mary Mclean reader because she wrote a lot for magazines and newspapers. She could never hold down a steady job. She'd get hired by a magazine or a newspaper to do something, and then she'd go off and do what she wanted.
So never wanted to get married, never settled in any way.
No,
I mean, it's so
never had
interesting
children.
because in Butte, those without going to college, your opportunities that she could see in front of her were marriage or one of these awful jobs that aren't going to pay the bills.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
I just think she's so fascinating and unfortunately a somewhat pretty tragic life and dying destitute, in a boarding house in Chicago. So sad for her potential that she had. But the book is really interesting because it does give you a sense of Butte in 1902 from a young woman's perspective, which is not the perspective of the Copper Kings or the other people writing about Butte. So I think it's interesting in that respect too.
That is fascinating. So Mary, focusing on gender history, seems it's not unsurprising that your research will come around to the historic role of food culture, food production in the American West, partly as a way of understanding women's labor, women's history, what they're doing. And really we have to sustain anybody who's living in the West, so food is of paramount importance. So you've written on topics that include good food in hard times and bittersweet, gender food and the state in the U.S. and Canadian West during World War I, just to name a couple of the things you've written. So tell us a little bit about why the study of food is so important and what, from your perspective, it can tell us about our history.
Well, as you know, everyone eats several times a day unless something is wrong. Whether they by choice or not. And it's something that we just take for granted. And yet it's one of those things, just like I think social history started out in the 1970s, looking underneath that story. So like, how is your food produced? How do you get lemons on a homestead in Montana? These kinds of questions. Who cooks? Who cleans up? There's lots of labor, the division of labor involved in here. And then I came to work on food because I was looking for another project in women's history. And I know this is blasphemous to say in Montana. But I was thinking about doing a a book on women's social activism, and I knew that I would have to deal, of course, with Jeanette Rankin. And I'm just tired of Jeanette. I mean, I love what she accomplished, but Jeanette has been with me since I came to Montana.
There's a lot out there. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah.
So, and I have to say, I have written about Jeanette, but I had enough. So I was, and I had an accident at the time, and people were bringing us food. And everybody who brought food had a story. You know, this is my grandmother's chicken soup. Mine is the best lasagna in the Gallatin Valley, et cetera, et cetera. And I started thinking about, you know, what I had said earlier, Nancy, about the labor landscape for women in Montana. And, you know, in a capitalist society, you get acclaim by the salary you make and the position that you hold in terms of the economic ladder. Well, when you are a woman who works her entire life without pay, how do you get any kind of acclaim?
Where's your stature come from? Where's your sense of identity come from? Yeah.
And I was sitting in my chair and kind of thinking about this one day, and I thought, food. You know, these stories that people were telling me in my house, but then I thought about county fairs, you know, or the state fair, or people who were famous for their coconut cake, or could I have that recipe, or tales I had heard, even though at that point I hadn't done too much rural history, of you know, traveling thresher crews and this kind of competition among farm women over who was going to cook the best harvest supper.
Right.
And would the workers come back to that farm because that was
really the best food. Oh, wow. So you competed for labor, basically, to get your harvest in.
Exactly. So I started thinking I could work on all the issues I'm interested in. Power, the division of labor, women's identity through the lens of food.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, we can then extrapolate that. I mean, so the way I started to prepare for that project was to design an undergraduate course on the history of food in America and just try to look at these issues of the cultural meaning of food for different groups. You know, so think about race and food. You know, think about the food that slaves raised and could not eat.
Right.
You know, how is food distributed?
Right.
Or the families in certain cultures where the men sat at the table, got the choicest bits of food, and whatever was left, the women and children ate. And if there wasn't anything left, they didn't have any food.
Right.
So I thought this is a really interesting way to look at power.
Yeah.
And I didn't know at the time, but it was, you know, probably in the subconscious world of historians, it had seeped into me that there was a lot going on in food studies.
I mean, power, labor, economy, environment, so many different levels of going on. Yeah. I mean, and then just aside from that, nutrition and health and all of that aspects too. Yeah. And of course, race and gender and culture. Yeah. So you could really go in many directions for the rest of your career.
Exactly. Yeah. Nice. And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
So Mary, I had the opportunity to sit in on your Food in America class one semester, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was amazing. We learned all about the history of production of food, consumption of food, and the cultural meaning of food in America from basically the colonial time to present. And it was such an interesting way to look at history, like you're saying. And for me, you know, with an interest in culture, to me, that really stood out as we were going through that class. But one of my favorite topics was the history of Chinese food in America. That was my favorite. I think you spent a week on that, or maybe a few days. I can't remember.
Maybe it just seemed like a week, Crystal.
Because I was so enthralled with it.
I would be hungry during every class, especially during. And Crystal has told me so much about the history of Chinese food from your class that I've been like, we can't wait to do this part of the podcast. And then I'm going to have to go eat some Chinese food.
I know that you're going to have to go eat Chinese. But the best part is that Mary would sometimes bring in food.
Oh my gosh!
I did bring in fortune cookies.
Yes, and your fudge. You brought in your
beef fudge.
Beef fudge. lunch, which actually is pretty good. Made with beef.
I'm afraid to ask, but very curious.
That's another long story.
Okay.
We'll do another podcast on beef fudge.
Okay.
But I want to ask you about the history of Chinese food in America, and especially chop suey. So can you give us a condensed version of your lectures on Chinese food in America?
Okay, I'll try.
Okay.
So, yes, chop suey became the iconic Chinese American food. And there are a couple of stories about how it originated, and nobody really knows the truth, which is so true of so much food history. And even the history of foods, like who the heck ever figured out how to eat an artichoke, right? You think about these things.
Wait, before you dive in,
yes,
can we just please start with my childhood and then jump all the way back to what you're going to tell us? Because I grew up with Mom making chop suey in a can, and every time I say that, everyone's like, "Oh yeah, my mom did that too. I forgot about it." And my mom worked in a Chinese restaurant. She loved Chinese food. We see pictures of her, and we're like, "Mom, you looked Asian in those pictures." I mean, it's fascinating. You can ask my sisters; they're all here. It's so funny. But in any event, she loved Chinese food cooked by real Chinese people. But then somewhere, as she became a mom in the early 1970s, we were eating chop suey out of a can, and the little noodles you would sprinkle on top. So now I'm really dying to hear the real history.
Okay. Well, so the two stories that there's actually a lot of literature now on Chinese food in America were that in the 19th century, of course in San Francisco, these hungry white miners came into Chinatown, and a lot of Chinese restaurants would just hang out a little yellow flag, which they were mostly for Chinese workers, just to say this is a restaurant and you can find food here. Oh. So these miners apparently stumble into this restaurant, which has actually closed for the day because they run out of food. And the miners demand food, and the Chinese, living in an environment of anti-Chinese sentiment, are not going to refuse to serve hungry white miners. Right. And so they just take whatever scraps are left in the kitchen and do what we now figure out is a quick stir fry with rice and serve it. And they loved it. Wow. And they ask what it was. And what they hear is chop suey, which apparently translated into a miscellany, right? So it didn't mean anything.
Interesting.
Okay. Then the other story is that in 1896, a Chinese diplomat who had been traveling in Europe comes to tour and visit the United States. And his visit is covered in a lot of newspapers. And one of the stories is that he didn't want to eat European food, so he would eat in chop suey joints in the various cities that he went to. And both New York and San Francisco claimed that this was the case for in their cities, and that it popularized Chinese food. Well, there's not a speck of truth to that. He did come. He did not go to California in protest against how California treated the Chinese.
Oh, wow.
And he was a very high-ranking Chinese diplomat. So he traveled with 3 cooks. He would never go to a chop suey joint for dinner. The cooks cooked in the hotel restaurant.
Wow.
But what his visit did was to make China and Asia in particular fascinating to Americans.
Okay.
And so what had been kind of restaurants for Chinese workers in cities that were patronized by some whites who felt very adventurous going into Chinatown, all of a sudden become, as they say, the chop suey craze, right?
Okay.
So that the number of chop suey restaurants in New York doubles.
So what decade is this?
This is around 1900.
Okay.
So his visit, the diplomat's visit, is I think 1896.
Okay, so right after it starts to really pick up.
Right. And what's interesting for the West, so of course, the Chinese are concentrated in California. After the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, those who stay have to find other work, and as Nancy said, they're in laundry and they're raising gardens, and they're working in Chinatowns congregate, and they start these restaurants, very humble, very cheap, so it's great for working people to go. They get a lot of food, and you can see all these little Western towns. I mean, I know you've both driven around the West.
Right.
And if there's not one in existence, you can see the sign from the Chinese restaurant. And usually it's one. right? So a place like Butte had several noodle parlors, and that's what they were known as, chop suey joints or noodle parlors.
Okay. Was there a difference between them, or just
no? It was just what they were called.
Okay.
And but Montana, like Joliet, Montana, had a Chinese restaurant.
Wow.
Malta, Harlowton, at one point Plentywood. This is all in the early part of the 20th century.
Wow.
That's amazing.
They're everywhere. But if you look at a map, they're all on the railroad.
Okay.
You know,
Or close, yeah.
Yeah, and so what some historians of Chinese food in America have argued is that places like Chinatown in San Francisco, after the earthquake and fire in 1906, the Chinese Merchants Associations rebuilt Chinatown as a tourist attraction. So the wonderful gates,
Yes.
that, you know,
Right.
that was
That you
all
see when-
designed to make the Chinese community seem safer.
Interesting.
And the restaurants would, you know, to combat all of the negative stereotypes of the Chinese and what they ate, etc., they would invite patrons to come through the kitchen so they could see how clean it was and what was being cooked. And so there's this kind of very savvy marketing to try and mitigate that deep animosity toward the Chinese. But in other places, Chinese found that, you know, if one family or one man and a companion moved to a town, one restaurant was not threatening to the community, right? They weren't competing for other jobs. So you have this diaspora out of the West Coast. And of course, you know, there were Chinese who had worked on the railroads in Montana. And they're connected through the Tong, the Merchants Associations and family lines. But it was, I think it was a tactic to stay and make a living, be able to send money back to China, to their families, where hopefully they could buy land and return at some point. And just minimize the kind of discriminatory treatment that they received if there was a group who seemed to be threatening.
So do you think that the goal of a lot of these Chinese who were opening restaurants in Montana was that they would be staying temporarily and it was to go back? So they weren't looking at permanent immigration and raising their children as Americans, not that they were necessarily being invited to do that anyway. Right. But that wasn't the goal necessarily.
Right. Well, and I mean, they didn't really have a lot of choice because the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882, said laborers could not come in. You had to be of a certain class. Only the wives of merchants could come in. So talk about a gender imbalance. Yeah, I mean, there are very few families, and the men were called sojourners. You know, this idea of coming and returning. And Rose Hum Lee, whom Crystal and I have talked about, she was born in Butte of a Chinese family, and she grew up and became a sociologist. And she studied Butte's Chinatown, and she wrote about how the Chinese would send money back to China to buy rice lands, and every year they would wait to hear what the results of the rice harvest would be, because wealth and status was
in rice.
Yeah. And that was, of course, a huge import to, you know, the West Coast for Chinese workers. Wow. So I think it's a fascinating history of sort of adaptation. I mean, they were never given the opportunity to assimilate.
No. I mean, they couldn't own land, right? At least in California. I didn't know if that was exactly the same all over. But
there were land acts that they couldn't own land. They could not become citizens.
They couldn't vote. They couldn't become citizens.
Right.
Unreal. So, I mean, what conditions to try to live and build a business under, you know, and then serving these people who,
But some of them did it amazingly well and became very wealthy, especially in Butte. There was some families that did very well, you know, so maybe not here as much in Bozeman, but in Butte for sure.
Right. And, you know, Butte still has the remnants of Chinatown, and I know that you have both been to the Pekin Noodle Parlor.
Yes.
Which is, I mean, there's sort of, you know, if you just Google the Pekin, and there was actually a story in the New York Times.
I know, last week. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
With great photographs.
Yeah.
Nice.
And so there's all these different claims. But I think what claim that would stand is that it is the longest operating noodle parlor owned by a family.
Okay.
By one family.
By
in the
one
West.
family.
And so different descendants, and this recent article in Times talked about which grandson bought from whom, but it stayed in that family. So I think there were probably other Chinese restaurants that might have been around as long, but not in one family's hands.
Right.
That's impressive then.
Yeah. So it's very impressive. And it's just an iconic institution.
And so they stayed here and weathered through the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act and were able to, have all these descendants. I mean, that's amazing. And then who knows how much money they had sent back to China over that time.
Right.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I love that. We haven't even touched on so many of the other communities in Butte, but that's certainly a really fantastic one to talk about.
We still have, these little Chinese restaurants all throughout Montana that are run by Chinese families, which I was just in Deer Lodge and a few months ago, and there was a Chinese family running the Chinese restaurant in Deer Lodge, and it was great food.
Right off the interstate.
Right off the interstate.
Oh my God, the food is the only place.
It's really good.
Okay, I need to know that. But there aren't like a proliferation of Chinese laundries all over the place.
No Chinese laundries.
No. And they were driven out because of, because like in Butte, the union said widows need work.
They need work, so you can't have
the white widows of men killed in the mines need work. Yeah. Don't take your laundry to the Chinese.
Wow.
Give that work to white women.
But see, I remember growing up with this commercial where this woman would take her stuff to the laundry, and it was a man and a woman, and the man would always do the front part, taking the thing in, and she would say, "How do you get these shirts and socks so white?" And he would say, "Oh, Mrs. So-and-so, she's like blonde hair and white. Ancient Chinese secret." I don't know if you remember that.
Well,
and then he would turn around, and his Chinese wife would say, she'd hold up the box of whatever soap they were trying to sell, "Ancient Chinese secret, huh?" And so there's still that stereotype, right, and perception that persists. Very interesting, though, that you're saying in a lot of places they were kind of run out.
Wasn't that commercial though for like a rice? Like
I don't remember it.
No, it was flakes that you added to the wash to get stuff right, because he was running a laundry.
Yeah.
Rice, right? Talk about a stereotype.
I mean, and there it very much is. No, but
I know, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
But I have such a memory. It's the same one of the guy who portrayed himself as an Indian, even though he was Italian, and he's the tier because people are, littering. And it's just like when you grew up, when I did, I'm like finding out all these myths behind those ridiculous facts you thought you were learning. Oh, my word. Yeah. Okay.
So, Mary, we've talked a lot about Butte, but I want to talk a little bit about what you do on a daily basis, which is teach at Montana State University. And you are a beloved professor at MSU in the history department, and teaching is really your specialty. There's a lot of professors who teach, but you are very good at it and very good at what you do. And I've talked to so many students who have gone through your classes in the history department, and your help for them, not just in the classroom but outside of the classroom, is so important to them. And you've really brought up so many generations of women's history historians, gender historians, food historians, just historians in general. And you've influenced so many people through your passion for this work, for your passion for history and your passion for looking at the past, but also making it relevant today. And that's, of course, you're the reason I'm here doing this work and doing this podcast today, because you were my committee chair for my master's degree, and you really brought life to this history and made...
You definitely put the people in history,
Yeah,
Mary.
but the
it's
people
never
in history.
dry. Yeah, which I think sometimes we have all experienced history that seems devoid of that personality in life, that we could relate to.
Yeah, and really made it relevant to today. So that's my question for you. Why do you think teaching history is important, and why do you think it's relevant, and why should we know history, not just students going into the history department at MSU, but the general public should know history.
Okay.
Yeah.
But is this where I'm supposed to say that the two of you are my very favorite students of all time.
Yes, that's
You
exactly
you
right.
definitely could if you want. We're not going to cut that out.
Okay.
No.
I should
I took your writing class, and that was amazing. Yeah, as a grad student, I know. Okay. Now you can go.
Well, that's such a complicated question, and I think there's so many answers. And I think that at this moment in our lives, where the country is so fractured on ideological lines, where the whole notion of a quote real fact comes into question, is a really important time to take history seriously, right? Because history, the appeal, I think, of history for all of us is these wonderful stories. But good historians tell the stories based on the most accurate records that they can find, right? The first rule is to be true to your sources, be true to those people, to the miners and the laundresses and the Chinese cooks and the prostitutes as best you can, right? To not invent their past for some present purpose. And so I think I think studying history is a way to be ethical. And I think that is a really important value today. I also think that studying history is really important because it shows us how at every single moment in time, life was complicated.
Yes.
People like to, how many times have we heard, the good old days, or when America was great, or in the good times, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look back, or the greatest generation, well, what's the greatest generation? The people who were in the Revolution, the people who lived in the Depression. Every generation has faced different challenges. We're facing this pandemic. And I think that people find some comfort in thinking about the past or the present as black and white. But if you study history, it's just not. People are irrational. Lives are chaotic. There's all kinds of forces that shape a person's decisions. And it doesn't always make sense if you don't try to understand the context of the time in which they're making those decisions. And I have to say that one of the most irritating phrases to me is, he or she was just a man or woman of their time.
That's what I get so frustrated about too, as if they didn't know, because I will hear that about the founding fathers all the time. Right. I'm like, but there was abolitionists. There always was. They knew they were making a choice. There were plenty of other people who had pointed out, and other places that were already giving up slavery. So I don't think people understand their history as well. And I love what you said, Mary. I was feeling, because I just finished teaching an intro to anthropology course online, and I asked them to reflect at the end. And a couple of people in one thing kind of mentioned how, well, it doesn't really have an impact on today, these things we study about the past. And I find that I have to address that when I hear that. And much like you said, I think that when we are trying to make decisions today, politically, economically, in the world, locally, whatever, we are asking questions like, well, what needs to be solved? And in order to solve it, we have to know how it got that way. And if we don't truly understand the history of how something got that way, we really can't even begin to make decisions about the future. And I think that's the thing that goes over a lot of people's heads who don't study it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that people, just as you were saying, and that was a lovely compliment that I made my classes interesting, it is unfortunate that a lot of history is dry for many people. And because how engaging it should be, to understand these questions. And I think that people sometimes, I think in our current world, people think of the sciences as hard, difficult, complicated, important. But they don't think of the humanities as hard, difficult, complicated, or important. And I've come to think of this analogy that, science may someday cure cancer, but the humanities can cure racism. And how many more people are affected by racism than are affected by cancer, right? If we understand why people are treated with unequally.
As they're not equal, yeah,
right.
exactly.
When they treated
not
unequally,
fully human, yeah,
not fully human. And the contemporary discussions about the problems of critical race theory and et cetera, all you have to do is read the most superficial American history textbook to see evidence of systemic racism from the very beginning of this country. Mm-hmm. And all of the kind of calls for liberty and freedom are also just these misreadings of, because they'll always reference the founding fathers, et cetera, et cetera. But the founding fathers also believed in civic virtue, right? That you had to put aside your own self-interest for the public good. Mm-hmm. And that rights come with responsibility. So if you don't take history seriously enough to really try and understand how complicated our past was, and as you said, Nancy, why we got here, how can we address these complexities? I also think history is important, and I do this assignment in my freshman class, is now that we can access Ancestry.com through the library, I ask students to just choose some relative and research him or her. Because I want them to see themselves as connected to the people of the past.
Yes.
Right? Yes. And that they're born in, 1999 or something like that, but they have people going back generations, whether they're adopted or they're blood kin, and they lived in different times. And what we're going to do in this class is learn about the times they lived in and then how you got here, right? Mm-hmm. So that we're not just kind of plunked out. The stork didn't drop us off in Bozeman, without a context, without a culture, without a past,
right.
Without reasons for why the people who are in our families or our communities think the way that they do. Mm-hmm. So to me, studying history is just as hard as studying physics. You have to try to figure out what the facts of a scenario are, where the quote truth lies,
where the
how people made decisions.
Well, that for me, taking a class on federal Indian law, you are doing history, actually, because you're studying from the beginning, and I don't think I ever comprehended as well as I did after that course how deep and entrenched the racism is in this country because of the way those decisions would be worded and made when you see them as going down as legal declarations. Or just what was said on the side, and then that's taken. I mean, it's astonishing. I think you said an amazing, wonderful things about what makes history relevant, a lot of food for thought for listeners. And because we're sort of ending our conversation today, we're almost out of time. We just want to see if you could give us a little teaser about what you're working on now.
So at this point in my career, I've decided I need to do things that are fun and enjoyable, and serious as well. And so I have 3 colleagues. Jan Zuha, who works at MSU. You all know Jan.
Yeah. We did a podcast with Jan.
Oh, we laughed a lot. Yes, so good.
And Zoe Ann Stoltz, who is the reference historian at the Montana Historical Society.
Oh, fantastic.
And Molly Krukenberg, who is now the director of the Historical Society, the first woman chosen as director of the Historical Society.
So very exciting.
It's very exciting. And we have been working on a book that we have tentatively titled Cooking Up the Past.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, a history of Montana foodways. So it's a series of short essays on everything from sauerkraut to Chinese food.
Awesome.
And so it's a lot of fun. It'll have a lot of illustrations.
Oh my gosh.
We're trying to use primary sources, so we're hearing voices and examples, and use old Montana cookbooks as sources, which have some recipes like pork cake.
Oh, I don't know. I can do beef fudge, but I don't know about pork cake.
No, I would way rather do pork cake. Ew. Anything that has meat and fudge in the same is just, whoa,
Maybe you'll have to do a cook-off.
Oh, yes. There we go. And then we have to eat each other. So that'd be really good. Okay. Okay.
We
have a lot to look forward to.
We
should host something here and do a workshop on some Montana recipes, maybe here at the brothel. That would be really fun.
Yeah. So when is that? When are you looking to?
I think it's going to be a couple years.
Okay.
Everybody, especially since Molly became director of the society, and as you know, Jan does so much work with the Ivan Doig Archive. It's and I'm have several PhD students I'm trying to usher to the completion of their degrees. So every summer we get a burst of enthusiasm.
Oh, good, good.
It's got to take it bull by the horns and go with it. And then who knows? Retirement sounds like it won't be retirement for you when that comes.
It's just going to mean more writing time, which is going to be so pleasurable.
Just a shift.
To be nice. Okay, well, we could talk to you all day, Mary, and we've probably talked to you longer than we should, but it was so nice to have this time with you. Thank you so much for giving us so much time today and coming and visiting with us in person, too. It was so nice to see you.
My pleasure to spend time with my favorite students.
Yay! I know, we're not at the university anymore, so we got to pull you out over here.
Yeah, right. That's great. Well, thank you, Mary, and thanks to all our listeners out there for joining us today. If you love this podcast, please share it with a friend and make sure to subscribe so it shows up for you each week on your podcast app. We also have a Facebook page called The Dirt on the Past, so make sure to find that and like it. We put links to all our podcast episodes, but we also include links to articles, books, whatever we've talked about in the podcast today. Thanks again, Mary, and we hope you can join us again to find out more about
The Dirt on the Past. A big thank you to our sound editor and guru, Steve Durbin, and let us know what you think of our new music by Lawson Allegria.